whatever. Welcome to week whatever. I am recording now, so hopefully y'all are muted. Welcome to week whatever this is of American literature, and we are wrapping up our unit on the Beat movement. Starting next week, we'll be reading Into the Wild by John Krakauer, followed by Wild by Cheryl Stray, and that will form a compact unit, those two books. And it takes a minute. They're both, chapter books. So if you haven't started those books, I strongly encourage you to do so. And we're really wrapping up the Beat unit now. Your blog has already been due for the Beat unit. And as I've been saying already this morning on the call, I've been reading those blogs and they are fantastic. But we just take a moment to celebrate the amazing life of this rebel and rabble-rousing wild woman poet, Diane de Prima. She embodied all of the things of the counterculture and the freedom and the audacity that we saw in a Kerouac and Ginsberg, but she did it as a woman, which was brave and bold in her time, would be even seen as brave and bold in our time today. She was a spiritual seeker. She was also a very creative person. She's also the mom of five kids. I don't know how many, if she has grandkids, but I reckon she probably does. So she's survived by all 5 of those children. And all over Twitter last night, that was my Twitter experience last night, was just reading tributes from fellow poet activists like myself. She's not like, I don't know what it was like a few weeks ago, when Eddie Van Halen died, or, earlier in the year when John Prine or Little Richard died, but it's still a moment for those of us who love poetry and also who care about the earth and ecology and activism, and those of us who have kind of the hippie spirit, and she was really a true free spirit. And that would be good switch now to talk about that time, because she, of course, was part of the New York School of the Beats, and Diane de Prima went on a pilgrimage to the West Coast, and she became a San Francisco Beat. So she really represented both coasts of the Beat movement, and she went to San Francisco, and the revolution out there was already underway. And Ginsberg and Kerouac and Cassidy and a man by the name of Kesey, I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, they were a seamless bridge. And when I read about the artists that we're going to talk about today, who are musical artists, the primary purpose of my talk today is to introduce you or reintroduce you to counterculture music via Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead. But what I want to tell you is this is a seamless bridge. If you talk to the Grateful Dead, if you talk to Bob Dylan, their music is beat music. They are informed by Kerouac and Ginsberg. They were reading Kerouac and Ginsberg. There's a great scene in the Rolling Thunder movie where you have Dylan and Ginsberg sitting together at Kerouac's grave in the mid 70s. And the Grateful Dead, I believe, played at this show, The Human Being, in January '67. I mean, they were the house band of the Haight-Ashbury, and then of the whole Northern California Back to the Land movement, Southern Oregon Back to the Land movement, West Coast kind of ecotopia, which we'll learn about in a novel later on at the very conclusion of the semester. And actually, the Grateful Dead are a character in Cheryl Strayed's book that we're going to be reading. But they say The Human Being was sort of the kicking off of the Summer of Love. And it was in January of '67 where they had this event in the Golden Gate Park. And there's Ginsberg. He was there. Timothy Leary was there. The Grateful Dead were there. And it was the time when the Beat movement became the hippie movement. And there was never sort of, a day when they passed the torch. It was a really integrated, seamless transition, because they were all part of each other. And these were all friends and colleagues and comrades and crew. They kicked it with each other. They, they got high together. They got arrested together. They did all of those counterculture things together. And so the movement really just transferred in that time. And already the Beats, of course, were rooted in the North Beach and now the Haight-Ashbury district, these different neighborhoods of San Francisco. And nowadays, of course, it's, I think they tax you on the bridge. I think you have to pay a toll to even get into the city, whether you're coming from the Redwoods or up there by, John Muir Park up there in the Redwoods, if you're coming from the East Bay in Oakland and Berkeley. I mean, really, San Francisco is too expensive, and they've sort of, over the generations, they've made this, a place, for rich people to have a counterculture. And I'll talk about that briefly when I get to the Grateful Dead, because definitely the hippie experience was something that people did who were generally seen as middle class, and they were seen as being dropouts. I'll talk a little bit more about that at a later slide. But I do want to acknowledge that if you there was a blizzard in Chicago in January of 1967, and if you would see why your professor is so obsessed with this, I might have been conceived on the same day as the San Francisco Bee, and the math lines up that I could have been conceived right around the day of the San Francisco Bee in January of 67, born in October of 67. And so this is my lineage. My parents were not full-blown hippies, but they did participate in the counterculture. So this is who I come from. You'll see there's a great story in the book about Ken Kesey. It's actually about Neal Cassady. And, you know, we neglect Kesey's role here. We're not going to get into him too much, but there's a great book by a journalist by the name of Thomas Wolfe. I believe the name of the book is The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And this is a journalist depiction of what was in the 60s. And you can get sort of a begins in the 60s. And what happens there is that a writer is not objective. The writer goes and places themselves and immerses themselves in this. And I like that reading some of your blogs. Some of your blogs were very immersive, whether you were talking about driving around, or whether you were talking about Buddhism, or whether you were talking about battling addiction or family members battling addiction. I mean, there was this whole encompassing thing in some of your blogs where you really grabbed the beat movement and jumped right in like you were going swimming at a swimming hole in some creek in Tennessee. So Kesey was a literary giant already, and his most famous book you've probably heard of is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey also was one of the people who went to a doctor and participated in officially sanctioned experiments with the mind-altering substances. And so Kesey was an experimenter. He took the medicine under a supervision of a doctor, and then he turned on, and that's why he wears colorful clothing and does crazy things. And they made this amazing school bus named Further. And Kesey also, like Kerouac, was a kind of an all-American guy. And there's a great documentary about the Magic Bus traveling around with Kesey, the films that they made, and you can now go and watch a documentary all about that. And if you set aside some of the medicinal side of it, you can see that there's this all-American adventure story going on with the Beats and the hippies. And at least some of you in your blogs, you really tapped into this idea of really how indigenous this is. And I don't mean like the natives that we studied, indigenous writers, because I mean hippies try to borrow from that, and some of that's a little gross. You put on feathers and and dance around like that. That can be seen a little bit creepy today, but no more so that pioneer spirit, that immigrant spirit, that traveling spirit. We come over on boats, we settle on the East Coast, and that kind of Lewis and Clark or westward spirit. So San Francisco, you can't get much further west in the United States than San Francisco. I guess maybe Alaska or Hawaii, but there was kind of this idea of, by the time America arrives in San Francisco, there's the gold rush. There's just so much mythology around San Francisco, and I've been visiting it for years. And I was in a church that Kerouac used to haunt, where it was a Catholic church, where suddenly the lightning bolt hit me that San Francisco, of course, is named after St. Francis, and St. Francis of Assisi was kind of like a hippie monk of many hundreds of years ago, and so there's just, I don't know, the Bay Area, it just kind of is the capital. It's an alternate capital of America, if you will. And Kesey, you can dabble in him in the book, but he was part of this group that was almost like an army or a band of rebels. There was other groups like them called the Diggers that gave away free everything. Everything could be had for free. It was just a time when people were experimenting, and not in any way just with substances. They were experimenting with the way a society should be organized. And they did kind of come up with this idea, that a free store where food and clothing could be free, medical care could be free, where a commune where people could work for their keep on land, people could live in a collective house, you could share the chores and the duties. And so people were able to live on the cheap initially. Now, of course, I was already saying that today, can't really live in San Francisco unless you have bank. But at the time, they found out a way to live cooperatively and to live on the cheap. And of course, I'm not going to go into it today, but the hippie movement had a dark side. There was bad. They always said there was bad drugs and good drugs. I mean, there was also violence. There was also Charles Manson. I mean, so we don't want to paint this too idyllically, but there was an idyllic aspect to it, a joyful ecstasy that was going on, a celebration of life that was going on. And they, of course, saw that in contrast to the war that was going on in Vietnam. And again, the seamless travel that happened is that so you've got this big old school bus painted up all these colors, and you're going to drive, the school bus around. You need a bus driver. And who better to be your bus driver than Neal Cassady, the Neal Cassady of the the adored Neal Cassady of On the Road, the adored Neal Cassady of Howl, the man that Kerouac and Ginsberg really looked up to as a kind of a vision. Now, that's, of course, the story in The Beat Reader is the story that Kesey wrote about the day that Cassady died. You need a bus driver, and Cassady was the bus driver, and he was wild. And you can see that all in the Kesey documentary. Definitely comes with a label warning. I can't make any vouch for what you'll see in that movie, but there's a great you can see what it was right up close and personal, because they really believed at that time that either you were on the bus or you were off the bus. And people got on the bus and they stayed on the bus. In 2017, I visited the Bay Area, and they had this epic museum exhibit on the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love. And I was walking through this museum exhibit, and it was a condensed and somewhat domesticated version of this, but they had artifacts that were so colorful and so beautiful and so vivid. And as we were walking around, and they would, they had light shows and they had the sound. I mean, they recreated the whole hippie happening vibe in a museum in Golden Gate Park in summer of 2017. And as we're walking through this exhibit, you could see that there were people there that had got on the bus back then and stayed on the bus. So these are like your grandparents, age, and they're walking around, and they had gotten dressed up in their old hippie clothes to come to the museum to go to the Summer of Love exhibit. And these were people that were veterans of that time period. And you can meet these kind of grandparent kind of crotchety old road dogs and wistful wild women. You can meet these old grannies and grandpas all over the Bay Area. I mean, they didn't go anywhere. They were still kicking it. It was really something to see. I very briefly referenced this guy in a previous lecture, but Harry Smith, beat, but he didn't really ever have also a filmmaker, a really, really great filmmaker. Can you hear me now, Betsy? I hope you can. Is it getting better? Okay, I apologize. It looks to me that everything's working, so if it does, it might be the internet, and I hate that. I hope the internet doesn't die in the middle of this talk. But Harry Smith was a very extreme eccentric. But why is he important? Is that in the 50s, a record label called Folkways, what they did was they took a collection of old 78 records that he had, and they released an album in the 1950s called The Anthology of American Folk Music. And it was 84 songs spread over several albums. And really, this is kind of the first mixtape. And it was really just Harry Smith's record collection of old 78 records remastered, I guess, or I'm not exactly sure technology-wise how they got the recordings, if they used tape or whatever, but they've somehow manufactured this and put it out on vinyls, 33 vinyls, and it became this artifact. It became an American songbook, and I want you all to keep that image in mind. An American songbook. And so it was all this old folk and blues, and very even the blues playlist that I required you all to listen to would seem very modern compared to this. These were a lot of hillbilly music, a lot of gospel music, and it was very rootsy, Depression era, early in the recording, when we barely even had recording abilities. And so this idea of the American songbook is something that I want you all to keep in mind as I go into the second part of the lecture, where I dive a little bit deeper into Dylan and the Dead, and keeping in mind that this also, according to the author Greil Marcus, is the old weird America. And this is this idea, at least one of you talked about this in your blog, that a lot of this stuff is strange, but it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool, like going to a thrift store or to a yard sale, or to your grandparents' old home place, and being allowed to, rummage around in the loft of a barn or an attic, where they have old crates and boxes of artifacts of the way life used to be. But the obsession with the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music is long-standing. Michael White, who's our guest a few weeks ago, and that video is out there because a lot of people weren't able to come that day. It was the Friday before fall break. You can go watch that video later if you're so intrigued. Was a friend of Harry Smith's. Of course, I went to Naropa Jack Kerouac School once. Michael went out multiple times, and he got to hang out with Harry Smith and become friends with Harry Smith. And it was, a relationship. And he, according to Michael's stories, I mean, he's just as weird as he looks, and as I had already heard. But by taking all of this old folk music, that really inspired what became the folk revival of the 1960s. And so this kid out of Minnesota, this kid from Hibbing, Minnesota, finds his way to, and he's reading Kerouac, and he's learning about Woody Guthrie, who was a Depression era activist, American folk singer. Of course, Woody Guthrie wrote This Land Is Your Land, and he's learning about those kinds of old folk musics that are on the Harry Smith anthology. And Dylan becomes an American songbook. He becomes a living American myth into one person. And he goes to Greenwich Village, and he joins whatever the beat and poetry scene that's there in the early 60s. And he starts putting out these records, and immediately people are saying, he's a poet, he's a prophet, he's the voice of our generation. His most famous song, the lyrics are on page 371 of your textbook. How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man? Yes, and how many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. And yes, and how many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? Yes, and how many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? And yes, how many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. Yes, and how many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? Yes, and how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? And how many times can a man turn his head pretending that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. And I would hope you would go and listen to that track and with the lyrics on page 371, and then go and call up these other tracks. And I'll be later providing you some links to some playlists and some other supplemental materials. There's a great movie on Amazon, No Direction Home. There's Netflix has the Rolling Thunder documentary from a couple years ago, which is has elements of mockumentary. The Rolling Thunder review on Netflix. The times they are changing. Come gather around people wherever you roam and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon that you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, because the times, they are a-changin'. Come writers and critics who prophesy with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheels still spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will later be win, for the times they are a-changin'. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up that hall. For he that gets hurt will be he who is stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. I'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times, they are a-changin'. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend a hand, for the times, they are a-changin'. The line it is drawn, the cure it is cast, the curses it cast. The slow one now will later be fast, and the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times, they are a-changin'. And of course, that last and first is a biblical reference, and there is this kind of almost scriptural quality to who Bob Dylan is. And the thing that Bob Dylan does for us also is that he raises this other question about what is worthy to be studied in the academy, and what can be studied under the umbrella of literature. And so in our textbook, it prints lyrics to 3 songs. And when I first, and of course, when Dylan, from the moment he arrived on the scene, people were like, he's a poet, he's a prophet. They said that about Dylan just right out the gate. Dylan duetted with Joan Baez at the March on Washington with another 1960s prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so his voice was kind of reverberating in the dormitory rooms on college campuses. He was, I don't know who would be comparable, that everybody listens to. I don't think there is maybe a uniting listening experience the way that some of these artists were. Dylan, only one of them. Of course, there's, the Beatles from the United Kingdom, and we'll be talking about another very important American group here in just a minute. So when I first, and I've been doing this, incorporating popular music into my American literature curriculum for a decade. And there's that voice over here off screen of that English teacher. And I reckon some of you thought that was going to be me. And when you found out that wasn't me, some of you were really like relieved. And then some of you were like, who is this guy? But there's that voice of that English teacher off camera, and he or she is saying, well, you can't do that, son. Son, that's not literature. Literature is F. Scott Fitzgerald, and literature is William Faulkner, and literature is Walt Whitman, even that weirdo Walt Whitman, but not this Bob Dylan gibberish. No, son, you can't do that. That's not literature. That's noise. That's rock and roll. You're crazy, son. And so, and I am crazy, certifiably so. But what happened is that he kept putting out these amazing, incredible records. And so he starts off as this kind of folk troubadour activist prophet, and the scrutiny and the attention that went with it, he couldn't handle. Like, he wasn't his songs. Dylan the human was not the song had a life of its own, and Dylan the human was not the song. And so what ended up happening is that the spotlight on this kind of folk troubadour prophet thing became a little bit overwhelming to him. And so he started listening to, probably to like the Rolling Stones, or maybe B.B. King. And so he put down the folk guitar, he picked up the electric guitar, got a backing band plugged in, and went live at the Newport Folk Festival on that great day, or that horrible day, depending on your perspective, known as Dylan Goes Electric, and he becomes a rock star. And then he keeps putting out these albums, you know, Highway 61 Revisited, you know, God said to Abraham, kill me a son, and Abe said to God, where do you want this killing done? And God said to Abraham, out on Highway 61. And so he becomes this just radical. I mean, they thought he was a radical when he wrote Blowing in the Wind, and then he becomes this other kind of radical, this kind of existential prophet. So he goes into the darker days of Dylan when he becomes this rock and roll prophet. And then he comes to Nashville and he starts hanging out with Johnny Cash, and he puts out an album like, you know, Nashville Skyline, and he becomes, you know, interested in folk music and of that kind of Harry Smith variety. But then he just drops a track like Knocking on Heaven's Door. And I swear there's somebody on the call who's like, that's a Guns N' Roses song, Mr. Smith. There's a musician from Africa called Andara. Andara came up in the 1990s. He's a young black musician, folk musician, who lives in Minneapolis. He moved to Minneapolis because that's where Dylan was from. But he was from Africa, and he was in the kind of in the 90s where if you wanted an early zeros, if you wanted internet, he was like probably in middle school. If you wanted internet, you had to go to an internet cafe. I wish I could say the name of the country Andara is from. I'll have to look it up later, but he's not from the US. And you couldn't just look something up on your phone. And he was talking to a buddy of his who also loved music, and they got into one of those kind of like, you know, debates that kids will get into, debating sport, you know, who's better, you know, the Vols or the Crimson Tide, and, you know, and then, or who drives a better car, you know, this, you know, NASCAR driver, that NASCAR driver, who's a better, you know, MLB pitcher, you know, who's a better soccer player, football player, you know, who's a better, you know, songwriter, Dylan or John Lennon, you know, the whole thing. So anyway, so Andara is sure that Knocking on Heaven's Door is a song by Guns N' Roses, and he gets into it with his friend. And at the time, all Andara is listening to is like, you know, Nirvana and like grunge and 90s music. And his buddy said, no, Knocking on Heaven's Door was written by Bob Dylan. And so he made a bet with his friend, and then he finally got to go and use the internet at an internet cafe. And of course, he found out it was Bob Dylan. He becomes obsessed with Bob Dylan and Neil Young, so obsessed that he decides when he gets there was a special immigration program for people from his country where you could sign up for a lottery. And if you won the lottery, you got automatic green card, legal immigration. So Andara legally immigrated from Africa to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he said it was awfully cold because he wanted to follow in the footsteps of Bob Dylan. He's released 2 albums, stunningly good folk albums that you should definitely check out. I feel like I need to go listen to them right now. But that's the kind of mythology that Bob Dylan is, that he can write a song like Knocking on Heaven's Door that'll get covered by 1 million people, and so much so that people don't even know, you know, it's like today I'm in the debate. Well, I'm not really in the debate, but I'm witnessing the sidelines of the Jason Isbell fandom, who are so upset that Morgan Wallen took that song Cover Me Up and made it bigger, you know, than it was when Isbell wrote it. So Isbell would be kind of like, you know, Dylan, and Morgan Wallen would be like Guns N' Roses. And I go off on a humongous tangent, so let me reel it back in. And then later on in the 70s, Dylan converts to evangelical Christianity. He'd been brought up Jewish. And in the mid 70s, he puts face paint on. I think you can see, I've got my Dylan. There he is. I'm wearing my Dylan today. Dylan with his crazy hat on. You can't really see it, but he's wearing face paint. And Rolling Thunder Review, which is a circus, like, you know, on a tour bus with poetry and all kinds of other side acts. I think Ginsberg toured with him at that time. And then he becomes an evangelical Christian, releases 3 incredibly amazing gospel albums, releases probably one of the best gospel rock songs ever called You Gotta Serve Somebody. And then he goes off on, you know, other tangents to the 80s. And he just here in 2020, he's in his, I don't know how old he is. He's an old geezer now. He put out a phenomenal album this year in 2020. Put out an album that's as good as anything he's ever done here in 2020, of original songs, of original material. He still tours with his band. His shows are phenomenal. He can't sing to save his life. I mean, he's got the He never had a singing voice, and he still doesn't, but he does. But he growls, he spits, he kind of, that sound of his voice is like coughing up broken glass and coal and coal dust, and he sounds like the leaf blower got stuck in his larynx, but he does it. He's just incredible. Oh, so I was trying to answer this one fundamental question of that English teacher in my head. Well, Greil Marcus said, you know what? Who cares? A couple of years ago, Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature. So finally, the fight is over. I don't have to argue anymore on behalf of the right for Bob Dylan to be considered part of the American canon anymore. He is in the canon. Dylan is literature. But what I learned in my process of studying this, and this is why this course is called American Literature, but I like to think of it also as American Studies or American Cultural Studies, is because literature, in the way that it was originally fashioned as an academic discipline, was the cultural lifeblood of a society. And today, a lot of English departments also includes popular music and television and film, because these are also the lifebloods, the cultural lifebloods of a society. And so to study what defines a cultural moment, you have to look at books and literature, and essays and writing. I think those are still very valid genres, but you also have to look at popular music and popular film and comic books and graphic novels. We have a professor here at Tech that specializes in the graphic novel. And so you have to be able to understand all of these other novels. But Greil Marcus, who was the guy that wrote the Old Weird America book, he basically said, about Dylan, is Dylan literature or not? Who cares? Dylan is Dylan, and he's worthy of our attention. He is so worthy of our attention. And I hope you all will spend some time learning about the multiple ways in which Dylan is important to who we are as Americans. And this is a slide here I stole from another university where they had a special topics course. You could take a whole semester on Bob Dylan, and that class was called The Many Sides of Bob Dylan. And I hate it. I've spent so much telling the story of J.S. Ondara and Knocking on Heaven's Door that I've neglected some time to talk about this other San Francisco band called the Grateful Dead. And so something we have to understand about the Grateful Dead is the Grateful Dead hired two poets, Robert Hunter and John Perry Barlow. So Robert Hunter was the main lyricist, and Barlow is the other. And so they weren't writing their own lyrics. They actually had like house poets, Barlow and Hunter, who wrote all their lyrics for them. But they became a community and a phenomenon. And they really, like Dylan, and here's where Dylan and the Dead are so in common, they also attempted to become their own American songbook. So the entire Dylan catalog is its own American songbook. The entire Grateful Dead catalog is its own American songbook. And the thing that's really cool about that also is that they deal in different genres. So for example, Dylan definitely deals in folk and rock primarily. Well, the Dead also deal in folk and rock, but as much as Dylan, even maybe more so, they have a strong traditional old-time bluegrass element. So there's that country and western element and that bluegrass element. So you've got rock and folk and country and western. And then what the Dead become champions of is improvisation, and they incorporate jazz, what later became known as electronic music. I don't think they were calling it electronic music then, but synthesizers, weird tribal percussion. Grateful Dead also becomes known as a live band. So there's elements of jazz, electronic, different percussion type musics, world musics. And so the Dead are this great American songbook. They span sort of all these different topics and generations. They've got these two poets who are writing lyrics for them. But they become kind of a phenomenon. And what's really interesting about the Grateful Dead too is that they aren't known as a band on record. So you can buy their records and they're phenomenal, but they become known as a band that you should see live, and that the live experience becomes this all-encompassing, completely immersive experience. Going to a Dead show is like going to church or going on going to a pilgrimage to see the pyramids, which they actually did, went and played the pyramids in Egypt, because that's just the kind of thing, the Grateful Dead do. But it becomes this all immersive experience. Now, it is very driven by traditional song structures. This year, 2020, is the 50th anniversary of two of their greatest albums, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, which both are driven by very traditional song structures. And I think you can listen to American Beauty straight through, and it will just seem like a basic pop, rock, folk album with a little bit of country thrown in there. You won't see the flourishes that they're known for in their live shows, which is the improvisation, which brings in that jazz. But because of the emphasis on the guitar, and particularly the guitar playing and kind of the sort of messianic sort of attachments that people place on their band leader, Jerry Garcia, it becomes this kind of quasi-religious experience. And coming out of the 60s, the Dead become really affiliated with the drug culture. And so fans would go, and they would take certain substances at the concerts, and they would have this kind of journey. They would go on a trip, if you will. And that's one of the most famous lines out of their song Truckin'. What a long, strange trip it's been, is this kind of, becomes the motif of the Grateful Dead. But they do a few things to sort of bring themselves into our imagination that also creates this idea of an American fandom. Now, most of you growing up here in Tennessee, the most acute image of an American fandom that is Tennessee Vols football. But people, depending on where you grew up and what your hobbies were, you can see in American subcultures, fandoms are a big deal. They might be Harry Potter fandom. They might be video game fandom. They might be cosplaying. They might be manga or K-pop or different musical genres, different art genres and art styles. So you'll see this idea. So in terms of them having a whole musical songbook is the one thing that makes them super interesting. The other idea is that they make this incredible musical fandom experience. And what goes along with that is that they create this kind of language, the secret language that's unique to the Dead experience. One of my Deadhead friends who's an author is Steve Silberman, and he wrote a book called Skeleton Key with another friend, which is a whole dictionary just of Grateful Dead lingo, but they become really known for creating their own iconography. So skeletons are really, really important. Roses are really, really important. The image on I think that would be on the right of your screen is called the Steal Your Face. The Steal Your Face, the red, white, and blue lightning bolt inside of a skull becomes like this trademark logo of the band, the Steely. And then people go and they make their own Steelies, and they'll put I made one with an eagle. I made a purple and gold Grateful Dead shirt with a Tennessee Tech eagle. It's not a Tech eagle, but I put an eagle inside a Steely face, and I put it on purple and gold, for Tennessee. And I took a lyric from a song they sing called Tennessee Jed, and I made my own Steal Your Face. You'll see a lot of college and universities and pro sports teams, incorporated in the Steal Your Face. And the Dead are an acquired taste. They're not easy to listen to. If you've never listened to them, they take a little bit of discipline to get through some of their stuff. But once you kind of get hooked, you get on the bus, you stay on the bus, and you'll find that we come from all walks of life. Another favorite of Dead iconography is the Dancing Bears, and I'm just kind of scratching the surface with the skulls, the roses, the Steal Your Face, and the Dancing Bears. But we become this community, and the community was known as the Deadheads. And what we do as a community is we go to shows, and back in the day, so it was expensive to do this. So these were mostly middle class kids. But once they went on tour, the way they lived is they lived kind of like gypsies and hobos. And so they had a car. You go to the concert, the parking lot becomes a open air market, kind of illicit open air market, not really approved. It becomes like an underground economy. So the parking lot, you'll have my favorite, of course, grilled cheese sandwiches, but you'll have good homemade food. You have all beverages of every variety. People who are interested in acquiring the magic mind medicines that go with the stereotype of the hippies, they can usually acquire that in the parking lot. You can buy all kinds of clothing, the tie-dye t-shirt, the long flowing dresses for the women. It becomes this whole thing, and you can tag people by the way that they dress, and there are certain kind of Grateful Dead, Deadhead, kind of stylistic motifs that you can spot them, immediately. These are some in the on the left. Is a scene of hippies at my college, the first college I went to in 1980s, which was Yellow Springs in Ohio, at Antioch, a small liberal arts college. And I don't know who that guy on the right is, but he looks a little bit too familiar to me, so I'm going to hide that picture again. I'll show it one more time. You'll blink if you miss it. But that was me circa 1987 when I went to my first Dead show. And I only got to see 2 shows and really kind of gave up on the band, kind of because I didn't necessarily like the stereotype of what the Deadhead were. But they had all kinds of these different like subcultures within the subculture. One of my favorite is the Spinners. And they've kind of died out, but I have occasionally at shows, I still go to, there's an offshoot band, and they've incorporated a young pop star by the name of John Mayer into their group. So they brought on a lot of young people when John Mayer, so you've got these 2 grandpas. Well, you've got the 3 original, you got Bobby Weir, and then you have the drummers, Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart, and then you've got 3 younger musicians that they've added to the band. One of them is John Mayer, and John Mayer's playing lead guitar. So John Mayer is playing Jerry Garcia's parts. John Mayer actually has a fairly decent singing voice, in my opinion, better than any of the original members. So they sound phenomenal. It's a great experience. So what a spinner does, and this is kind of like the Whirling Dervishes, which was an ancient Middle Eastern group, but they spin the entire time. And let me tell you something. We're kind of slowly coming to my conclusion. There I am again in the 80s. So in 2009, I got clean and sober from drugs and alcohol, and I was going to Bonnaroo in Manchester. And you can imagine that Bonnaroo is not that safe of a place for a newly sober person to be. And I saw these yellow balloons at the Bonnaroo, and they would have 12-step meetings around the clock during the music festival for people who are in sobriety but like to rock out, so they could get a support group meeting so they could make it through the show without using drugs or alcohol. And raise my hand, sober person who loves to rock out. I was like, these are my people. So this was at Bonnaroo. It was called Soberoo, and everybody there like different genres of music, but they were providing support. And I have this friend from Louisville, Kentucky by the name of Patrick, and Patrick had started these meetings at Bonnaroo, and now he has a nonprofit foundation, and they help sponsor clean and sober support tables and 12-step meetings at giant music festivals all over the United States. And I was there, my first sober Bonnaroo, and anytime I go to Bonnaroo, one of my favorite things about the Bonnaroo experience is getting to go to Clean and Soberoo and getting to go to these meetings. And so I did just a little bit of research, and I said, well, where did the yellow balloons come from? And somebody told me, well, they come from the Wharf Rats. And I was like, well, what are the Wharf Rats? And in the 1980s, a bunch of Deadheads got sober on Dead Tour, and they were such committed Deadheads that they created the 12-step meeting at set break. A Grateful Dead concert is about 3 hours long, and they take a break in the middle. That's called set break. They would have a 12-step meeting every night at set break, and the Wharf Rats are still going, and they still go to every kind of Dead affiliated tour. And I said, well, I'm a Wharf Rat. I want to be a part of that. And joining the Wharf Rats became a way that I got back into the Dead, because there was this myth when I was a kid that you had to be intoxicated to enjoy the Grateful Dead. Like if you weren't intoxicated, the music sounded like total crap. Well, that's a total lie. If you actually let your ears and your body, and you, like I said, it's an acquired taste. It requires discipline. Listening to Grateful Dead music is not like a fly-by-night kind of thing. It's not background music. You have to be committed to the experience. But I do it when I exercise a lot, when I walk, ride my bicycle, when I'm alone, because my wife doesn't like the Grateful Dead nearly as much as I do. But, you know, it's become a humongous obsession of mine, and the music is absolutely phenomenal. And I found this little tribe within the tribe. And the thing about it is these clean and sober groups at rock concerts are a huge gift to the bands, because a lot of bad stereotypes accumulated around this organization to the point where they almost went out of business, you know, completely. You know, well, Jerry Garcia, their leader, died, and he was an addict. He wasn't clean. And so The Grateful Dead organization is highly supportive of the Wharf Rat community, and having us at these shows to provide that alternative. So not only are we providing support for the Deadhead that's already clean and sober, we're also providing a way for people who are interested in learning about what we have. We don't proselytize, we don't promote, but people who are at a show and maybe want to make a change in their life, they can see that example that the Wharf Rats are providing, and maybe make a change in their lives for the better. I'm going to provide you guys some links to some further listening suggestions. And I'll try to keep that somewhat to a minimum, given I know how much time you have, but you guys can listen to some of these things in the background while you're doing some of your other schoolwork. And we'll be talking about a lot more about mixtapes. I'll be talking about your blogs that you just finished, and we'll be just kind of wrapping up this unit. Will be coming to our final closure to this unit on Wednesday. So hope you guys can get back on the call on Wednesday. We're out of time for today. And thank you all so much for being at American Literature today on this Monday, October 26th, almost Halloween, almost November.